Welcome to Resilience and Resolve with Lance Drury.
Welcome back to Resilience and Resolve with Attorney Lance Drury. Lance has spent more than 30 years helping individuals and small business owners resolve serious tax problems. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about what happens when the IRS believes taxpayers may be hiding income or assets. Even when someone is trying to resolve a tax issue, actions that appear misleading or incomplete can quickly complicate the case. Lance Drury, sir, welcome back.
How you doing, Evan? It's always a big pleasure to be here with you.
I'm great. Now I get to talk to my man Lance. We get to talk all this tax stuff. So when the IRS, reviews someone's financial situation, what kinds of things might cause them to believe assets or income aren't being fully disclosed?
Well, they can access records. I had a guy once, we had called up the IRS to try to submit his financials, and we get in the middle of it, and she puts me on hold for 5 to 7 minutes, comes back and says, I got to transfer this to a revenue officer. I said, why? He's got 15 rental properties that he hasn't disclosed to me. So if you think that you're going to get away with that kind of stuff with the IRS, it's not going to happen. All of your assets are subject to public record just about, and they can access them, your motor vehicles, all of that kind of stuff. So it's not a good idea to try to play games with Uncle Sam. You're just going to get yourself in trouble, and you might be subject to criminal investigation if that happens.
How does the IRS typically detect situations, though, where financial information may not match what a taxpayer is originally reported?
Well, what they do is when they're looking at the expenses, if they're self-employed and they got a big number for a certain expense, that's probably going to be a red flag to the IRS, might trigger an audit. But the other thing is, if you put something down on that financial statement, you better have documentation, particularly if you exceed the national standards. The national standards, it's a list. For example, housing and utilities. The IRS will tell you how much you can take for housing and utilities, and it varies depending upon the county in which you live and the number of people in the household. Now, it's arbitrarily low. So most of the time, we have to submit documentation so that the IRS will give the taxpayer their actual expenses as opposed to the national standard. So a lot of times you have to submit proof to the IRS to back up what you're putting on that paper or what you're telling the IRS your expenses actually are.
So, Lance, what role do bank records, the business filings or that third-party reports play when the IRS starts looking more closely and deeper into someone's finances?
Oh, it plays a huge role. You get a revenue officer, they're going to want at least 6 months of bank records. If if you're being summoned by an auditor, they may subpoena those bank records. So those, particularly for a business, it plays a huge role. And here's what I tell people, because there have been times when I've had a problem getting a resolution for a client because they were co-mingling their personal with the business. There was no separate business account. And so the auditor or the revenue officer, or whoever was handling the case on the IRS end, was having a hard time figuring out what is personal and what is business. And so I tell everybody, you set up your own business account. You only put business income in there. You only take out business expenses. You don't pay any of your personal expenses. Then you know what you had in there beginning of the month, what you have in there at the end of the month. Then you know right away what your profit is. And, it's a huge problem when people get audited at the state level. They like to go after restaurants and convenience stores because they think they're hiding money. And I had a woman once, the business wasn't doing that great. And the problem is she put her own money in there, but she didn't have a paper trail. She would go to her bank, take out cash, put it in the business. And, that's the biggest problem is these self-employed people do not keep good records, and that just gets you in serious trouble, particularly at the state level.
But sometimes, the taxpayers move money or transfer assets without realizing how it may appear. What types of transactions tend to raise those questions with the IRS?
Well, let me tell you a war story, Evan. I had this case several years ago. The guy comes to me at the 11th hour from Springfield, Illinois. He drives to my St. Louis office on a Saturday. And what happened was he was in federal court. The IRS had taken him to court because he owed $200,000 in trust fund civil penalty taxes, had never gotten it resolved. And after he had that problem, he quit claimed his one half interest in the marital residence to his estranged wife for no monies. You can't transfer assets for less than fair market value. It's considered a fraudulent conveyance, not just for the IRS, but for any creditor. Because just think about it, Evan, how many people would transfer assets just to get out of paying their debts if they didn't have that? And so what happened was they filed like a 3-count petition. They wanted them to set aside the conveyance as a fraudulent conveyance. They wanted to sell the home, and they wanted her to keep her half proceeds, but the rest of it would go to the IRS. Well, I was dealing with an attorney out of Washington, D.C. We never had to appear in court. It did take a while, but finally we settled for about $60,000 on a $200,000 plus debt, and they got to keep the house.
Mm. So you work with clients also, though, who didn't realize certain actions could, create that suspicion. You have another situation where clearing up that misunderstanding helped move a case maybe forward.
Well, we do this a lot of times. People come to me and they say, well, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, or this is my kid's vehicle, but it's in my name. Well, if it's in your name, it's your vehicle. So, we have to counsel people all the time. If they want to set up a new bank account, that's fine, but they can't take funds out of an existing bank account so that it doesn't get levied and switch it to another account. Because that's a fraudulent conveyance. Obviously, they can use up the funds in that bank account to pay reasonable and necessary expenses for the business or normal household expenses, but you can't just outright transfer the money. So I tell everybody, before we give you any advice on what to do with your assets and your expenses, give us the financial statement first. Let us get that down. Then we can perhaps give you advice on how to structure your assets, how to structure your expenses, so that in a legitimate way, you can get a better deal out of Uncle Sam. We're not going to do anything that's fraudulent, I can tell you that.
When the IRS believes an asset may be hitting, how does that change the way they approach a tax resolution case?
Well, it's going to be a lot tougher to get a resolution until that matter is cleared up. There may be further investigation. There may be a criminal investigation. I got to tell you, we still have this client. We're working on an offer in compromise for him. But before that happened, he was under criminal investigation by the IRS. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, they wanted documentation for certain business expenses. Guess what? He had no documentation. His accountant flew up here from Houston, Texas to talk to me in Missouri. And he said, I just put down the numbers that he told me to put down. So he didn't even supply his accountant with any documentation. And I can't believe it. I don't know how we did it, but we prevented any criminal charges from being filed against him.
So speaking of that, so how can that suspicion, affect these options, like the payment plans, the settlements, or the attempts to resolve the debt?
Well, like I said, it's going to be much tougher to get a settlement agreement until that happens. And here's a related one. It's not really germane to the subject we're talking today, but here's the other problem. People who go on these boats and gamble, the only thing that's reported to the IRS is your winnings. You better keep track of your losses yourself so that you can prove to the IRS it's going to be taxable income. And the other thing is, until you clean up your gambling habits, you're going to have a hard time getting a resolution with the IRS because they don't want you spending your money gambling when you owe them money. And so we've had this happen a lot. And so that's the first thing we do. We tell them to stay off the boats because we're not going to be able to get you a resolution till you have a proven track record of not gambling your monies away.
What mistakes do people make, Lance, when they try to manage these tax problems, while moving money or assets around at the same time?
Well, the problem is that they give them away for less than fair market value. And that's not the way to do it. I'm sure it would be okay, and I don't know that we've ever done this, is if they transferred an asset and had a written agreement that they were going to get paid back over time the fair market value. Of course, that would have to be reported as income. But that would be a legitimate way of doing it. But the problem people make is they just give it away. I'm going to give this to my child, or I'm going to take this bank account and transfer the monies to a new bank account, or, things of that. And you just can't do that, Evan.
So, Lance, for someone listening, who is dealing with the IRS and worried about how their financial situation might be interpreted, what should they understand before taking that next step?
Well, they need to understand that you cannot transfer any of your existing assets without receiving fair market value in return for that asset. Because otherwise, the IRS or any other creditor can attack that as a fraudulent conveyance. You're going to end up in court. You're going to have that transfer set aside, and it's just going to cost you a lot of time and a lot of money. So be wary of making any transfers for less than fair market value.
Good stuff, Lance. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Evan. It's always fun.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening to Resilience and Resolve with Lance Drury. When dealing with the IRS, transparency and careful planning can make a significant difference in how cases develop. If you're facing IRS tax problems and want guidance before the situation becomes complicated, visit lancedrurylaw.com. Be sure to like, subscribe to the show, and leave a review if you found this episode helpful. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.